I wanted to talk about this today, emotional granularity, because it's coming up a lot of the time that it ends up bringing these tensions in between us and people of different generations that we work with. So let's dive into what emotional granularity is and how that's impacting our work environment right now. By the way, my name is Jade. I'm an emotional intelligence facilitator and I work with organizations and individuals to help elevate their emotional intelligence so you have a more happy and fulfilling career. All right, so let's dive into what this is. Because a lot of us haven't heard the term emotional granularity. Some of us might have a general idea from hearing it as to what that may be, but I'm going to give you some more perspective on that so that you can start to assess whether or not this is an issue for you and the people that you work with who are in different generations within your workplace. So let's talk about it. Okay. Now, we right now have workplaces that have lots of generations in them, multiple different generations, some of which that still have boomers working within them, right? So we get a lot of differences in knowledge and values and pockets of culture. And one of the main things that can come up and cause issues amongst these different generations is whether or not they have high emotional granularity or low emotional granularity. Keeping in mind that everybody, even within generations, have different levels of this. Okay, so what is it exactly? Well, emotional granularity refers to an individual's ability to precisely identify and articulate their emotions. Okay, so somebody with higher emotional granularity can differentiate between feeling frustrated, overwhelmed, and disappointed. So they're able to really pinpoint exactly what it is and put a very specific psychological label on what it is that they're feeling rather than just simply stating, I feel bad or stressed, right? And then this significantly influences how we process these emotions, interact with others, and handle workplace challenges. Now, there's research that shows individuals with high levels of emotional granularity tend to regulate their emotions more effectively, leading to better problem solving and decision making, as well as collaboration. So, those with low emotional granularity, however, might struggle to express their emotions constructively, leading to miscommunications and workplace conflict. Now, let me be clear. It is up to us to filter whether or not the response or the behavior we're having is constructive in our work environment or disruptive in our work environment. Okay. Only we can really figure out what that was for us. So, when it comes to this emotional granularity, it varies across generations, though. And again, within each generation, I mean, there are some Gen X's out there who have high levels of emotional granularity. It truly just depends on the amount of interest that they've taken in that subject matter and how much they've dived into that and learn about it themselves, right? It is very individual. However, on a broader spectrum, because I don't want to pick on anybody, but it can be helpful when we go to work with individuals that we don't have a great understanding of, that we don't know very well, if we can have a general idea to start and then ideally learn more about them from that point in time and figure out really where they stand and how we can adapt to work with them. So for boomers, right? They're often were raised in a suppress and move on mentality when they were growing up. Okay, so they weren't encouraged to explore their emotions very much. So the way this can manifest in the workplace is they really prefer the problem solving over discussing the emotions around what it is that's happening, which can really lead to them being perceived as really emotionally detached. Even though we all have emotions, they're not gone. They didn't go anywhere. That still happens. But thinking about the social awareness piece, this is how you're being perceived when you approach a problem this way, right? Or it can be how you're perceived. And that can lead to disruptive behaviors in the workplace. Now, Generation X. And again, I'm not trying to pick on anybody, everyone's an individual. But for the sake of moving forward with people that we haven't really connected with in the workplace, it's good to have an understanding of where they may be at and what generation they were raised in can give us some insight to the particular culture that they grew up with. Now, this generation grew up with more exposure to self help movements and workplace emotional intelligence training, but they still largely value independence and resilience over emotional expression. So their level of emotional granularity may be higher than a boomer's, but still less nuanced compared to younger generations. Now, millennials were raised during an era of mental health awareness and emotional validation. And millennials are more likely to articulate their emotions and advocate for their psychological well being at work. They often expect open communication around feelings, which can lead to a clash with older generations who see this as unnecessary and overly sensitive. Now, you might be thinking right now, oh, I've run into this before. This makes a lot of sense now as to why this interaction happened the way that it did. All right, that's good insight. That's great perspective. We can use that as a way to elevate our own emotional intelligence. Okay. And then lastly, Gen Z. So, growing up with mental health discussions really embedded in the social media that they've been exposed to, and even now the education that they're getting, Gen Zs have the highest level of emotional granularity of any previous generation, which makes sense if you think about it, right? Each generation stands on the shoulders of the next generation. Right? That's how we've gotten to where we are with emotional intelligence and the fact that we're even talking about it. So it makes sense that Gen Z would then, on a broad spectrum, hold the most emotional granularity in comparison to the rest of everybody else. Okay. And they're really more likely to name very specific emotions and expect emotional intelligence in the leadership and really push for psychological safety in the workplace. And that's not a bad thing because when we are able to create these emotionally intelligent workplace cultures, the whole organization benefits, right? It's not just the individual, it's everybody as a whole. An organization is made up of people. So when one individual benefits, we all do, especially when it comes to this emotional intelligence piece. Now, there are many different things, and I'm sure you can think of so many examples, but I'm going to give you a few just to break down this understanding as to where this emotional granularity really comes into play when we have misunderstandings and misinterpretations. So, one example would be a communication breakdown. A Gen Z employee may express feeling burnt out and undervalued, well, a baby boomer supervisor may interpret this as complaining rather than a legitimate concern. Now, I'm sure you've either witnessed this, been a part of this, or have heard stories of this before, because it does commonly happen. And this is a communication barrier that we have, right? It's like Gen Z is speaking another language, even though that language was built up from those boomers, Gen X's, and millennials, right? There's still a big disconnect there, and we need to bridge that gap with elevating our emotional intelligence. And then we have misinterpretation of emotional responses. So, for example, a Gen X manager may see a millennial's need to discuss workplace stress as unnecessary venting rather than a means of emotional regulation. And when we have a manager being dismissive of a team member, then that's going to cause that employee to disengage entirely. And we've created this really disruptive behavior amongst both people then in the workplace, right? So you can start to see how this emotional intelligence really plays into having a more constructive and successful environment. And then we have, lastly, this divergent conflict resolution styles. So, a baby boomer, for example, might prefer to move past a disagreement quickly, while a millennial or Gen Z employee may need a detailed conversation to process that emotion before moving on. So when we've got this high granularity and low granularity, and it's always varied in the workplace, but when the gap is really big, that's when we end up having more things like those dramatic moments that we have in the workplace that take up a lot of time, that you feel like you need to invest a lot of energy into to move past. And saying dramatic, I'm not trying to downplay or disregard anything that's happening, but that's often how it can be described. It's because there's a big gap. It's because there's a big gap in emotional granularity, and you need to start to bridge that gap. And it's not just the people who have high granularity who get off not having to do any training. There is training there as well, right? Both sides need to meet one another to then have more success when you're working together. So, the way you do this is by leveling up everybody's emotional intelligence to try and bring everybody to a very similar perspective, which will help everyone learn how to identify what they're feeling, as well as have more social awareness so that we can interact more collaboratively and have more synergy as a team, right? And then we also want to work on really normalizing that emotional inclusivity when it comes to conversations, because that's where we create a lot of the culture of our workplace. And if we're not inclusive, then we're going to have a lot of disruptive behaviors that are coming out amongst our team members, right? Where somebody might be being isolated. Other people might have really negative perspective of the work environment, which seeps out and also depicts other team members' perception of what is happening here. So it's really important that we learn to elevate that emotional intelligence. You can do many other things as well to help bridge that gap with your emotional granularity, but I highly recommend collecting more knowledge. This is a great start to really build on that within your team so that you can see that difference. And if you are an individual, building on that yourself, right? And if you feel like you already have high emotional granularity, that's great. Perspective about others not having the same level of education when it comes to emotional intelligence, and making sure that we know how to elevate and leverage our patience while others are learning, even if they are older than us, is a valuable, valuable skill set to take forward that's going to make the work experience successful for not only you, but everybody involved. So I hope that was helpful and it gave you a bit more insight into what this emotional granularity really is, and that you can take some of those tools that I talked about today. But really, there is so much more that you can do. And I highly recommend you have a look at my on demand trainings to help elevate that emotional intelligence for you as you move forward.